Everything you do depends on both your genes and your environment. Consider facial expressions. A contribution of the environment is obvious. When you smile more, the world is treating you well. When you frown, things are going badly. Does hereditary influence your facial expressions? Researchers examined facial expressions of people who were born blind and therefore could not have learned to imitate facial expressions. The facial expressions of the people born blind were remarkable, similar to those of their sighted relatives. As shown, these results suggest a role for genetics in controlling facial expressions. Controversies arise when we move beyond the generalization that both hereditary and environment are important. For example, do differences in human intelligence depend mostly on genetic differences, mostly on environmental influence, or both equally? Similarly, questions arise for sexual orientation, alcoholism, weight gain, and mental illness, and much else that interests psychologists and the general public. This module should help you understand these issues. Even when the answer remains uncertain, we begin with a review of genetics, a field that has become more and more complicated as research has progressed. Mendelian genetics. Prior to the work of Gregor Mendel, a late 19th century monk, scientists thought that inheritance has a blending process in which the properties of the sperm and the egg simply mixed like two colors of paint. Mendel demonstrated that inheritance occurs when it occurs through genes, units of heredity that maintain their structural identity from one generation to another. As a rule, genes come in pairs because they are aligned along chromosomes and also in pairs. The exception is this rule is that a male mammal has paired X and Y chromosomes with different genes. Classically, a gene that has been defined as part of a chromosome composed of the double-stranded molecule, deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA. However, many genes do not have the discrete locations we once imagined. Sometimes several genes overlap on a stretch of chromosome. Sometimes a genetic outcome depends on parts of two or more chromosomes. In many cases, part of a chromosome alerts the expression of another part without coding for any protein of its own. A strand of DNA serves as a template, a model for the synthesis of RNA molecules. A single strand chemical, one type of RNA molecule, messenger RNA, serves as a template for the synthesis of protein molecules. DNA contains 4 bases: adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine. The order of those bases determine the order of corresponding bases along an RNA molecule. Adenine, guanine, cytosine, and uracil. The order of bases along an RNA molecule, in turn, determines the order of amino acids that compose the protein. If you have the same genes on your 2 copies of some chromosomes, you are homozygous for those genes. If you are an unmatched pair of genes, you are heterozygous for those genes. For example, you might have a gene for blue eyes on one chromosome and a gene for brown eyes on the other. Genes are dominant, recessive, and intermediate. A dominant gene shows a strong effect in either their homozygous or heterozygous condition. A recessive gene shows its effects in the homozygous condition. For example, a gene for brown eyes is dominant and a gene for blue eyes is recessive. If you have one gene for brown eyes and one for blue, the result is brown eyes. Each base determines one base of RNA. A triplet of bases determines one amino acid. Some proteins become part of the body structures. Others are enzymes that control the rate of chemical reactions. Now we have sex-linked and sex-limited genes. The genes on the sex chromosome, X and Y in mammals, are known as sex-linked genes. All other chromosomes are autosomal chromosomes, and their genes are known as autosomal genes. A female mammal has two X chromosomes, whereas a male has X and Y. During reproduction, the female necessarily contributes an X chromosome, and the male either an X or Y. If he contributes an X, the offspring is female. If he contributes a Y, the offspring is male. Exceptions to this rule are possible. Distinct from sex-linked genes are the sex-limited genes. Okay, so sex-limited genes are present in both sexes, but active mainly in one sex. Examples include the genes that control the amount of chest hair in men, breast size in women, or the amount of crowding in roosters. There's genetic changes. Genes change in several ways. One way is by mutation, a hereditary change in a DNA molecule. Changing just one base in RNA to any of the other three types means that the mutant gene will code for a protein with a different amino acid at one location in the molecule. Given that evolution has already had eons to select the best makeup of each gene, a mutation is rarely advantageous. Epigenetics. In addition to mutations that cause permanent changes in genes, the field of epigenetics deals with changes in gene expression. Every cell in your body has the same DNA as every other cell. However, the activity of a gene can vary. The genes that are most active in your brain are not the same as those active in your lungs or kidneys, and those most active in one part of your brain are not the most active in another part. How could an experience modify gene expression? First, let's look at gene expression is regulated, and see how environmental factors can influence that regulation, okay? Standard illustrations of the DNA molecule show it as a straight line, which is an oversimplification. In fact, proteins called histones bind DNA into a shape that is more like string wound around a ball. The histone molecules in that ball have loose ends to which certain chemical groups can attach to activate a gene. The DNA must partially unwind from the histones. Hereditary and environment. Does singing ability depend on hereditary or environment? That question, as stated, is meaningless. Unless you had both hereditary and environment, you couldn't sing at all. However, we can rephrase that question meaningfully. Do the observed differences among the individuals depend more on differences in hereditary or differences in environment? For example, if you sing better than someone else, the reason could be different genes, better training, or both. If the variation in some characteristic depend largely on genetic differences, the characteristic has high hereditability. Hereditability changes from 0, indicating no genetic contribution, to the variation to 1, indicating complete control. But how could we determine the hereditary of a characteristic? Researchers rely mainly on three kinds of evidence. First, they compare monozygotic from one egg, or twins, and dizygotic from two eggs, twins. People usually call monozygotic identical twins, but that term is misleading because they sometimes differ in important ways. For example, some are mirror images of each other. Some of them are right-handed and the other is left-handed. Still, they have the same genes, where dizygotic twins do not. A stronger resemblance between mesonic and dizygotic twins suggests a genetic contribution. However, that evidence by itself is not totally decisive, because the way you look influences the way people treat you, and therefore the way you act. Researchers sometimes also examine virtual twins, children of the same age, adopted at the same time, into a single family. They grow up in the same environment from infancy, but without any genetic similarity. Any similarities in behavior imply environmental influences. However, the behavioral influences, which are in many cases substantial, suggest genetic influences. Environmental modification. Even a trait with high heritability can be modified by environmental interventions. A prime example is phenylalanine or PKU, a genetic inability to metabolize the amino acid phenylalanine. If PKU is not treated, phenylalanine accumulates to toxic levels, impairing brain development and leaving a child mentally retarded, restless, and irritable. Approximately 1% of Europeans carry a recessive gene of PKU, fewer Asians, and almost no Africans have the gene. How genes influence behavior. No gene produces its effect by itself. A gene produces a protein that interacts with the rest of the body's chemistry and with the environment. Now, there's an evolution of behavior. Charles Darwin, known as the founder of evolutionary theory, didn't like the term evolution. He preferred descent with modification, emphasizing the idea of changes without necessarily implying improvement. Evolution is a change over generation in the frequencies of various genes in a population. We distinguish two questions about evolution. How did some species evolve, and how do species evolve? To ask how a species did evolve is to ask what evolved from what. For example, because humans are more familiar to chimpanzees than to other species, biologists infer a common ancestor. Fossils also help to illuminate changes over time. As new evidence becomes available, biologists sometimes change their opinions about the evolutionary relationship between one species to another. In contrast, the questions of how species do evolve is a question of how the process works. And that process is a necessary outcome from what we know about reproduction. The reason goes as follows. Because of genetic influences, offspring generally resembles their parents. That is, like begets like. Mutations, recombinations, and microduplications of genes introduce new heritable variations that help or harm an individual's change or chance of surviving and reproducing. Certain individuals reproduce more than others do, thus passing on their genes to the next generation. Any gene that is associated with greater reproductive success will become more prevalent in later generations. Therefore, the current generation of any species resembles the environment causes a different gene to increase the probability of survival and reproduction. Then that gene will spread in the population. Because plant-animal breeders have long understood this idea, they choose individuals with a desired trait and make them the parents of the next generation through a process called artificial selection. Over many generations, breeders have produced exceptional racehorses, chickens that lay huge numbers of eggs, hundreds of kinds of dogs, and so forth. Now, there's common misunderstandings about evolution. Does the use or disuse of some structure or behavior cause an evolutionary increase or decrease in that future? You may have heard people say something like, because we hardly ever use our little toes, they get smaller and smaller in each succeeding generation. This idea is a carryover of biologist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck's theory of evolution through the inheritance of acquired characteristics, known as Lamarckian evolution. According to this idea, if you exercise your arm muscles, your children will be born with bigger arm muscles. And if you fail to use your little toes, your children's little toes will be smaller than yours. However, biologists have found no mechanism for this type of evolution. Does evolution mean improvement? It depends on what you mean by improvement. By definition, evolution improves fitness, which is operationally defined as the number of copies of one's genes that endure in later generations. If you have more children than average and they survive long enough to reproduce, you are evolutionarily fit, regardless of whether you are successful in any other way. You also increase your fitness by supporting your relatives, who share many of your genes and spread them by their own reproduction. Any gene that spreads is, by definition, fit. However, genes that increase fitness at one time and place might be disadvantages after a change in the environment. For example, the colorful tail feathers of the male peacock enable it to attract females. Okay. To further illustrate evolutionary psychology, consider the theory interesting example of altruistic behavior. An action that benefits someone other than the actor. A gene that encourages altruistic behavior would help other individuals survive and spread their genes. At a possible cost to the altruistic individual, could a gene for altruism spread? And if so, how? How common is altruism? It certainly occurs in humans. We contribute to charities. We try to help people in distress. A student may explain something to a classmate who is competing for a good grade in a course. Some people donate a kidney to save a life, someone they didn't even know. A better explanation is kin selection. Not right now. A better explanation is kin selection. Selection for a gene that benefits the individual's relatives. A gene spreads it if it causes you to take great efforts, even risking your life to protect your children, because they share many of your genes, including perhaps a gene for protecting their own children. Another explanation is reciprocal altruism, the idea that individuals help those who will return the favor. Researchers find that people are prone to help not only those who help them, but also people who they observe helping someone else. Even young children show this tendency. The idea is not just you scratch my back, so I'll scratch yours, but also you scratch someone else's back, so I'll scratch yours. By helping others, you build a reputation for helpfulness, and others are willing to cooperate with you. This system works only if individuals recognize one another. Otherwise, an uncooperative individual can accept favors, prosper, and never repay the favors. In other words, reciprocal altruism requires an ability to identify individuals and remember them later. Humans, of course, are excellent at recognizing one another. Even over long delays, a third hypothesis is a group selection. According to the idea, altruistic groups thrive better than less cooperative ones. Although this idea is certainly true, it faces a problem. Even if cooperation groups do well, would an uncooperative individual within the cooperative group gain an advantage? Like, let's say Scar from Lion King? Nevertheless, theorists have concluded that group selection does work under certain circumstances, such as when cooperative individuals do most of their interactions with one another. Group selection works especially well for humans because of our ability to punish or expel uncooperative people. At its best, evolutionary psychology leads to research that helps us understand a behavior. The search for a functional explanation directs researchers to explore species' different habitats and ways of life until we understand why they behave differently. The approach is criticized when its practitioners produce explanations without testing them. In the control of behavior, genes are important, but not all important. Certain behaviors have a high heritability. So let's close this out. Now, in genes and behavior, our genes and our evolution make it possible for humans to be what we are today. But they also give us the flexibility to change our behavior as circumstances warrant. Understanding the genetics of human behavior is important, but also especially difficult, because researchers have such limited control over environmental influences and no control over who mates with whom. Inferring how human behavior evolved is also difficult, partly because we do not know enough about the lives of our ancient ancestors. Finally, we should remember that the ways things are not specifically or necessarily the same as what they should be. Even if our genes predispose us to behave in a certain way, we can still decide to try to overcome those predispositions if they do not suit the needs of modern life. In summary, genes are chemicals that maintain their integrity from one generation to the next and influence the development of the individual. A dominant gene affects developmental regardless of whether a person has pairs of that gene or only a single copy per cell. A recessive gene affects development only in the absence of the dominant gene. Genes can change by mutations, microduplications, and microdeletions. Gene expression can also change in a process called epigenetics. As chemicals activate or deactivate parts of chromosomes, experiences can cause epigenetic changes, and in some cases, an epigenetic change can influence the next generation. Most behavioral variations reflect the combined influences of genes and environmental factors. Heritability is an estimate of the amount of variation that is due to a genetic variation as opposed to environmental variation. Researchers estimate heritability of a human condition by comparing monozygotic and dizygotic twins and by comparing adopted children to their biological and adoptive parents. They also search for genes that are more common in people with one type of behavior than another. Even if some behavior shows high heritability for a given population, a change in the environment might significantly alter the behavioral outcome. Genes influence behavior directly by altering brain chemistry and brain chemicals, and indirectly by affecting other aspects of the body, and therefore the way other people react to us. The process of evolution through natural selection is a necessary outcome. Given that we know about reproduction, mutations sometimes occur in genes, and individuals with certain sets of genes reproduce more successfully than others do. Evolution spreads the genes of the individual who have reproduced the most. Therefore, if some characteristic is widespread within a population, it is reasonable to look for ways which that characteristic is or has been adaptive. However, we need to evaluate the relative contributions of genetics and cultural influences. Thank you for listening. Hit subscribe for more psychological biology.